Welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you here for this episode. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I'm in the Pacific Northwest. I've written a few things, and I'm a senior writer, or editor, I should say. I do write for them a little bit, but I'm not a senior writer. I'm a senior editor at Touchstone Magazine. Okay, Glenn.
Glenn Sunshine. I am a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, right for Breakpoint there. I also am a ministry associate. I think that's my current title with Reflections Ministries. I work for them. I have my own ministry as well, Every Square Inch Ministries, where I've got a lengthy lecture on the plague available for donations, and do a few other things as well.
Great, fun stuff. Okay, Tom, why don't you introduce yourself and then take it away? This is your show. We've got an interesting article that you've given to us to think about.
All right, I'm Tom Price. I'm a teacher. I do some speaking and some writing. And one of the places I do teach is Gone Well Theological Seminary. I teach Christian ethics and theology. So back to Oxford. That's where we're going today. But this time we're not directly talking about C.S. Lewis or a pilgrimage, but we will be talking probably a little bit more about that by the time we end up, since we have a good announcement to make. But I assume, I can't remember if he's a professor, but I think he's professor of moral theology at Regent Park College. That's the Baptist-linked college there in Oxford. And his name is Luke Bretherton. The first time I've heard of him, and I don't even know how this article, I think it slipped into one of my feeds, and I thought, well, okay, this is interesting. It's called The Conversion of Public Intellectuals, Two Pathways. And I think he kind of begins with this increasing phenomena, even amongst those like the Richard Dawkins of the world, that are attracted to increasingly the cultural benefits of Christianity. There's sort of a loss being recognized as certain kinds of woke ideas penetrate Western civilization and provide sort of almost a sort of acid that starts to melt things away from that heritage. And so the Bretherton himself talks about his own formation theologically under the older conditions of the kind of new atheists like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, and even speaks of sort of his own form of Christianity as being on the defensive. And always kind of looking at the culture around them through a negative lens at how it had produced this kind of secularism without God. So I think that sets up what where he wants to let us know he's coming from. But he writes, to grow up Christian and then become a theologian working in British universities against this background noise was to live with a sense of being on the defensive. This is why I found so enthralling and, if I'm honest, somewhat liberating, a podcast and now book called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God by the British journalist and Christian apologist Justin Brierley. Are you familiar with Brierley at all?
Nope, first time I've heard of him.
Yeah, I haven't either.
I've run into him a few times. I wouldn't say I'm terribly familiar with him, but I have run into him.
Okay. And so in the first time, he says this kind of listening to the podcast was a kind of intellectual exorcism, which is an interesting turn of phrase. We'll see exactly, I think, what he means by that. But one of the things that the apologist Brierley was onto is chronicling this kind of rise and fall of the new atheism as an intellectual movement, but the attraction of at least cultural Christianity, or what you could say kind of liberal cultural Christianity on the whole for people like Dawkins, right? But also the attraction to figures like Jordan Peterson, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Paul Kingsnorth, Douglas Murray, and Luise Perry, these figures. And so I guess some of these were interviewed for this podcast and book. And then, of course, I'd probably not highest up there on the intellectual list, at least for the writer, would be Russell Brand. and who notoriously has depicted himself and shown himself being baptized by another celebrity in the River Thames. And then there's this kind of attraction also to certain forms in particular of Christianity, with a huge rush towards, I think, the Catholic intellectual tradition as, centralized symbolically in joining the Roman Catholic Church. He noticed in the U.S. two prominent examples of conversion, Sohrab Ahmari and Harvard professor Adrian Vermeule. Is that how you pronounce that? Yeah. Both recent converts to Roman Catholicism. And so he sees on the one hand this kind of intriguing, but I think it bothers him, and he's going to unpack why it bothers him. I think one in particular is he noticed that these conversion narratives in each of the cases are bound up with a critique of contemporary culture. And what they see is sort of the influx of woke ideologies and the decline of Western civilization. And so for these intellectuals, he quotes, Christianity seems to function as a bulwark against the imminent collapse of West into barbarism of one kind or another. And he traces this kind of disposition to 19th century thinking about the Christian faith as kind of the last bastion of kind of Western ideals. And once it goes, a kind of barbarism will spread in. And he talks about Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's a very famous convert these days to the Christian faith. Is she the one who debated Richard Dawkins recently?
Yeah. It's not it wasn't exactly a debate, but it was a discussion.
Yeah, they're friends, so it's not like.
Yeah, well, she was one of his kind once upon a time, and so I think he's a bit baffled to why she would go all the way beyond just appreciating Christian culture to actually embracing the faith of Christianity and its kind of story. So he talks about here where Ali narrates her move from Muslim to atheist to Christian, but at the heart of her account of Christianity is Western civilization, and basically its need to be recovered and preserved.
Yeah, can I jump in here? One of the things that he sort of omits is that for Ali, it isn't really all about preserving Western civilization.
That's right.
When she talks about this, she was speaking to her a counselor, psychologist, someone. She was dealing with issues of depression and such, and she was asked, "What kind of God could you believe in?" And she wrote down a list of characteristics. And she prepared a list of characteristics of what that God would look like. And when she looked over the list, she was describing Jesus. And that was one of the key things that moved her to faith. It wasn't just this issue of preserving Western civilization. Yeah. She saw in Christ something that she knew in her heart was what God had to be like.
Yeah, that's an important thing to consider, Glenn, because I think sometimes when we exclusively frame this in terms of a civilizational crisis, we lose touch with the personal dimensions of the faith. And marvelous thing about Christianity is that it's all the above.
Right.
It's not like we have to choose between these two things. Like I think of Marxism, it's more or less a vision for society, and who cares if it runs over your life and makes you miserable? It just kind of is what it is. It's not, no one has a personal relationship with like Das Kapital or something like that. If they did, they'd be, they'd be in counseling like she was.
Yeah. But people maybe in the West do have a relationship with capital. At least they think they do. But on the flip side, I mean, and I think there's some fair critique. I get the projectionist notions of what we do. But I think what he's wanting to do here, and I think you're right, that point was very right on for both of you. She mentions and he mentions this notion that we need a unifying story. And I don't think that this is simply her saying Christianity is only to be seen as a function of providing a meaning framework that happens to hold Western civilization. This is sort of what it seems like he's suggesting, she's saying, and they are saying.
Right. One thing that he sort of seems to ignore, and I suppose we'll get into this more as we're looking at his argument, is you can't replace something with nothing.
Yeah.
And fundamentally, the problem, and I don't think he completely appreciates this. The problem is that when you move to a purely secular outlook, what you've done is you've replaced the meaning and purpose that comes from even cultural Christianity with nothing. There is no meaning, there is no purpose in a materialist universe. And this is why Islam is growing in environments where atheism has been deeply rooted. It's why paganism, neo-paganism, superstition is growing there, because you can't replace something with nothing. And he seems to be unhappy with the idea that people are arguing that Christianity is what ought to be replacing this as a foundational civilizational idea. But what are the alternatives?
Yeah.
I think, though, I'm not sure he's arguing that, for nothing, so much as he's afraid of a kind of fascistic nationalist kind of Christianity.
Yeah.
If you get to the end of the article, that's where he zeroes in, where he's talking about Maritain and stuff like that. And my guess is that he wants something like Maritain. He wants something that is sophisticated, cosmopolitan, universal, sort of appropriates Darwinism, all the things we associate with Maritain.
Yeah. Well, that's right. And I guess we'll get to a lot of the kind of lines to get to kind of what he's suggesting. But I think that kind of helps unpack kind of what he's up to. But he is a little bit irritated by this notion, I think, that I think for here, that this step somehow is a step that's going to functionalize Christianity to serve and play into a kind of ideological culture that is detached from a vibrant living faith and is more the imposition of an ideal that is a distorted ideal of Christianity and will actually do more harm than good. I mean, I think this is where he's going. So he talks about sort of the way, like Hirsi Ali and other recents combine the embrace of Christianity, culturally or confessionally, with this sense of the collapse of the moral and social basis of Western civilization. Now, to be fair, they're not originators here. I mean, I doubt he would say, or maybe he will, that, for example, Pope John Paul or the former Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, who wrote tons of books on this that are pretty theologically and philosophically and politically astute. Think of the series of lectures that Ratzinger gave on the roots of Western culture and spirituality and the deep embeddedness of Christians' riches that have this lasting impact on the world for good and create the kind of world that, this gentleman would like to see. And if you start to pull the rug from under those theologically, you're right on. Something else isn't simply going to come and do it. Something else has already come and done it, and it's been bringing ourselves to a sense of crises that are leading people to these conclusions. I mean, look, if your two options that have come about in the current culture in which we are in the West leads to auto-creativity on the one side through its rationalist line detached from its theological roots, or the kind of absolute determinism that comes through the Hobbesian Marxian line, right, that we are nothing more than the byproduct of natural forces, social forces, and everything else, those two lead to a death sentence on culture and the human being. They're the death sentence. It isn't simply, this is just one more culture that has its struggles and we have to just kind of breathe fresh air of the spirit into it with love. No, you have to engage the problematic pathologies intellectually and spiritually that are causing the kinds of extreme moral decay that you confront in the here and now. I don't get where these things are at odds with each other.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right there, Tom. And there, the number of things that I had questions about in this article are sort of legion. But you're right that he seems to be making the argument that he's correct in the sense that we are living in this particular cultural moment. Yeah. And we have to live as Christians within this cultural moment. We can't go back to the past. That would be a mistake in any event because the past wasn't perfect, which is also true.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we don't want to embrace the present either because the present is far from perfect either. And there are all kinds of issues that he just doesn't seem to... I mean, he doesn't seem to want to deal with the kind of moral decay and issues that you just brought up. He in once, I think there was one sentence where he sort of acknowledged that, but he really doesn't seem to want to go there. He basically says, look, this is the environment we're in. We need to sort of embrace it and operate as Christians within it. And I'm not sure that's the right answer.
Well, I also think he downplays the significance of a tradition. I mean, a civilization's tradition. In other words, there's a sense in which he wants to abstract some ideals from that past, almost without any sort of acknowledging any debt. So let me read a section of the essay to give you a sense of what I mean. So he's criticizing some of these people because of their what he thinks is kind of a nostalgia for the history of the West. So he says, one forbear they echo is a common critique of the West made from the 19th century onward. This framework poses Christianity, as you noted, Tom, as the last redoubt against a future of domination and depravity brought on by the degradations of modern life. This framework narrates the emergence of modern Western life not as a story of progress whereby we become rational, autonomous, and enlightened beings, able to enter into emancipated ways of life. Rather, it is a story whereby becoming modern involves a tragic loss of the ties that bind us, whether to each other, to the land, or to our ancestors. In this story, modernity does not make us free. Instead, individualism and moral relativism are its characteristic fruit. The modern, supposedly liberated self is left without direction or purpose and utterly naked and alone. To change this situation and thereby renew the West entails recovering our connection to those like, with scare quotes, us, and scare quotes again, our land, and to European traditions, and most important of which is Christianity. Well, see, that's my point. He downplays, or at least he calls into question, the legitimacy of the critique. I think the critique is absolutely right on. I think that autonomy and kind of relativism and individualism and all these things that we celebrate today are killing us. And I think that, his fears, I do think there is something to say for them. His fears are fascism and nationalism. Those are the things he's afraid of. Yeah. And I think that there's something to say for that argument, but I don't think he is doing justice to the critique.
Yeah, and I think the other thing he is doing is he's setting up a false dichotomy. Yeah. There are genuine positive things that do come out of modernity.
Yeah.
But there are also genuine harms that are done by modernity. Yeah. And he acts as if modernity is either all good or all bad. Yeah. And as if those are our only choices. And I think that is a serious problem.
And I think he's trying to say that that's for those who would be interested in retrieving some of the riches of Western civilization and its Christian roots. He's thinking that's how they think. It's either all bad or you have to go. And notice to where he goes. It's a straw man here, because there are probably some, but not most, that are arguing the way to deal with the Enlightenment's, problems are simply to go back to blood and soil and pure, ethnocentric, European tradition. The fact that people want to retrieve aspects of what got eradicated in the Enlightenment, one's connectedness to histories and traditions, is oftentimes the flip side of what happens when you try to eliminate something that is so fundamental to be a human being, that they're from places, that they're from families, that they have from traditions of language and everything else. Culture is not simply all artifact, right? It is bound up with reality. And we being part of reality are also bound up with those things. So the Enlightenment attempt to just bracket those out and act like they're not significant, and to expect it not to come flooding back at a certain point, especially when postmodernity opens the door for it, wokeism in particular, shouldn't be a surprise. But I think his error here is there are plenty, like C.S. Lewis, who wanted to retrieve culturally riches from the past, discarded images that actually help us navigate the here and now in richer Christian ways and richer human ways from the humanities tradition. And so retrieval for him, it may have started out scholarly, but it was never a return to repristinization. And it wasn't romantic nostalgia. It was forward-looking in many ways, because it was saying that we can navigate these problems with a set of insights and wisdom direction from those wiser than us who aren't here in the here and now, right? That there are, it's kind of like as a teen coming up against your first set of experiences, you don't have the wisdom to navigate, and you turning to the wisdom that was given to you by your parents or your elders to say, you know what? Don't do it that way, do it this way. You know what I mean? There's insight that has come there. But these things, without having these, you can't really steady or direct your relationships in the current with anything. And to talk about, we just need to come up with fresh new ways to understand how the Spirit and Christ are working in the here and now, directed by what? What's your measure? If you don't have, first of all, a theological measure, right, which requires your investment in an intellectual tradition, then you don't theologically know how to navigate what's of the Spirit and what isn't, right?
Yeah, I'm familiar with this kind of treatment and approach. All three of us are. We've experienced it in academia for years and years.
Yeah.
I want to read a section where he kind of lays his cards on the table, and it's right along the line of what you've been talking about, Tom. He says, the life, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus, rather than Western culture, or a particular intellectual tradition, are the condition of the possibility of movement into new kinds of relationship with God and neighbor. So in other words, we're abstracted into kind of an ethereal kind of thing.
Yeah.
Any such journey of conversion demands that we orient ourselves to living in time and the experience of flux, and transition, so nothing permanent, everything's in flux. That is part of what it means to be a finite and fallen creature rather than a God. Becoming Christian is properly about discovering with these people. In other words, every single moment you're just kind of like being brought into existence out of nothing apparently.
Yeah.
In this place and in this time, communion with Christ amid and through our differences, a communion we receive only as a gift from the Spirit. Again, without any sort of allusion to a tradition or language or theology or anything that's been done to help us connect with any of these things. Seeking to encounter Christ where the Spirit is blowing here. And this is, again, the same kind of airy stuff that you run into in New England, particularly with the Congregationalists, where you'll see, the Spirit is still blowing. What does that mean? Well, it means we don't think being gay is a sin anymore, or something like that. That's always the way it's used.
It's self-fulfilling prophecy. It's where it always ends up, and it's amorphous. Notice how it has no form.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately is the issue of tradition. And I don't mean tradition in the Roman Catholic or Orthodox sense of the word here. It seems to me that he's got this completely backwards. When you remove people's tradition, when you cut them off from their history, and increasingly in our world, you're cutting them off from their family. I mean, what % of kids are being brought up in single-parent households? When you cut them off from their culture, when you cut them off from the land, when when you're in a society that's as mobile and transient as ours, when you cut them off from all of these things, you put them in a situation where they are much easier to control, much easier to manipulate, much easier to rule. And it seems to me that this rootlessness that we are producing in the modern world is much more conducive to fascism than a society that is genuinely anchored in tradition.
Well, and that was Hannah Arendt's point, in her entire treatment of, she's looking at totalitarianism generally, but she's writing in the aftermath of the Second World War and reflecting mostly on the Nazis, and that's exactly her point, is that when you end up with rootless, ahistorical people like you saw in Weimar Germany, that kind of thing, then you have the conditions that make fascism appealing. If you already know who you are, and there's no question, and you're rooted, and you're not looking for something to join. You just well, I'm a Frenchman. You know what? There's nothing. I don't have to prove it to anybody. That kind of thing. I don't have to beat my chest about it or anything like that. Well, you end up with the very thing that he's. In other words, you're right. I'm agreeing with you, Glenn. He's kind of impaling himself on his own argument.
Well, and that's the rootlessness that is drawing people to roots, and even Christian roots. And I think this, just talking about a kind of a formless form of Christianity that only manifests itself in quote unquote differing new episodes of love, unifying communal relationships. That doesn't tell me anything. It doesn't tell me anything.
You sound like one of the lectures I was subjected to at Harvard for years.
Yeah. And what it does is it always lets the society determine the agenda for the church.
It does. And I get the hints of, and we all know this, here we have an eschatology that basically is in redemptive vision cut off from a proper view of its connectedness to creation and reality. And so it's always about the endless flux of new creation, right? Rather than the renewal, restoration, and refabricating of the Edenic order, which is affirmed by Christ and reaffirmed by the resurrection. And so you have eschatology, but eschatology, all of the newness presupposes and is transformative and transfigurative of the original creation and the meaning of its order. And so notice this. I mean, here's a critique where he would be coming after kind of some of the moves that a lot of us have made. He goes, in this story, modern Western culture is not a problem because it produces this or that instance of injustice, immorality, right? So here's an abstract notion of injustice, immorality. It is a problem because it inverts the moral order and makes what Augustine calls the libido dominandi a point of virtue. Well, let's think about that for a minute. Does not the libido dominandi, when it becomes let loose on a society and embedded within the power structures of that society, wreak havoc and do all kinds of injustices? And part of the injustices it does is not give certain creatures, the human, their due. So the fact that societies, when they aren't properly oriented to God and neighbor the right way, they end up with these kinds of injustices, right? And so the point is we shouldn't be critiquing the fact that those who want to retrieve some of the good gifts of Christian heritage of the West are those that are looking to preserve the created order as best as you can in a society and receive the gift character of other humans so that you can practice justice towards them. It's not an either or.
I think this brings up something we've talked about many times, and that is your inability to selectively sort of regard your past. So, for example, if we think about Thomas Jefferson, there are a number of things that we could say are not good about the guy, but there are other things that we can say we owe him a great deal, and we need to have that kind of. We need to have that, but we don't need to tear down every single statue. If that were our approach, then we would have no statues ever at all, because everybody's got something in the closet or something that they that we could say, well, that thing about Robert E. Lee, that thing about Churchill, whatever, we're going to completely just throw him out because of that stuff. Well, we didn't build the statue necessarily. Now, sometimes you build the statue for the wrong reason, but you don't build the statue necessarily for the things that everybody can see, or should see are bad. You build the statue because of the things that. So, like, let's think about Robert E. Lee, an obvious case. So, in his case, why are the people building a statue in his memory? Well, because he was loyal to his tradition in Virginia, and he was steadfast and honorable in the way he conducted himself in wartime. As far as I know, we don't attribute any massacres to him. We don't think about him as being, I guess, repugnant in terms of how he treated his enemies and things like that. He fought, but he did it. If you're fighting if you're on the wrong team, at least you can get points for conducting yourself in a really good, upright way,
honorably.
Right, and that's what we remember about him, or we should remember about him. Now, there were guys like Sherman on the other side who we could say was on the right team, but you could say, is everything that we associate with Sherman good? No, there's a reason why we call a tank a Sherman tank, because he just wiped out just things.
Well, that's it. The either-or fallacy, it's flawed when dealing with reality. God causes the rain to fall on the good and the bad, and sustains the evil and the just in life, and they all are permeated by its impact and effects, and they all contribute to it. We can't sanitize history. I'm with this person on that. Neither do we repristinate a time in the past and say this exemplified a time when there was no idolatry and no injustices. And see, I think he thinks that that's what Rod Dreher and these other figures are doing. Is he says this? How does he put it? The Benedict option and Christian National illustrate a way of being critical of modern Western life that too easily gives rise to a nostalgic reactionary politics. Reactionary is often fueled by a resistance to change and a desire to recover an imagined past that is envisioned as lost or stolen. Such movements seek to reconnect with an illusory point of origin about when things went bad. And firstly, I don't think, even being aware of Dreher and others, that is not what they're on to.
He's getting Dreher horribly wrong. He does not understand a word the man has written if he's actually read any of it.
Well, and
by the way, with Rod, I think he's been treated very poorly by all sorts of people, including fellow conservatives. So anyway,
yeah, I would agree.
Well, and also this notion that these groups are trying to reconnect with an illusory point of origin before all things went bad. No, when I talk about, for example, in the West, when certain views of God shifted in the impact of those metaphysically, and they're still with us. First of all, there's plenty of sources to document it, and it's not hard in the here and now to see episodes of it. But secondly, you're not saying that there was a time in which it was perfectly held together and there were no cracks. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here right now, right? The cracks, there were obviously cracks, and these cracks opened up into a flood. But here's a way of thinking of it for him, I guess I would ask, is when we try to communicate the rich understanding of Christians of Christ and the Spirit from within a Trinitarian framework, are we repristinating Nicaea when we go back to their findings in order to draw upon their rich wisdom and insight to unpack its meaning and significance for us in richer ways today? The same with the doctrine of the Trinity, which he keeps appealing to. I mean, I could say you're just drawing upon a idolized notion of propositional understanding of the Trinity that you're trying to make here and now at the exclusion of all the other voices that you're marginalizing by calling God Spirit and Christ.
Well, I've heard exactly that argument in liberal circles, where the Hellenization of Christianity is something that we should be rejecting, and we should be, kind of celebrating sort of a liberal, sort of a liberationist view that doesn't seem to recognize its debt to a bunch of Germans in the 19th century.
Yeah. Well, I'm actually, this is somewhat of a tangent, but I'm actually teaching my way through the book of Revelation right now. And as you're going through the letters to the 7 churches, anybody who thinks that the early church was pristine really needs to read that a little bit more carefully. Norman Cousins once said that history is a vast early warning system. And that's true of church history. It's true of all history. And you can't. Nobody in their right mind actually believes that there was any point. I mean, if you understand original sin, there was never any point at which any of this stuff was perfect. And I don't think the people he's citing believe that either. That there was a perfect point in the past.
There are small groups of Christians who do believe that for like 15 minutes after, the Spirit fell at Pentecost, it was like heaven on earth, and it's been downhill ever since. So people like the Primitive Baptists and stuff like that. Yeah. But I'm speaking with my tongue, in my cheek.
I might give them 15 minutes.
But all retrieval and renewal in the church has always come to resourcing. And that's returning to the sources that are the core and fundamental identity of the people that you enact as part of the Christian community in any here and now. And those things, when we lose sight of those roots and those traditions and our place in them, we are losing much of what informs our here and now practice to be in continuity with the genuine article. And he's almost as though this is a little bit like Barth's Romans 1, is any old form of the faith is nothing but a bomb crater where the Spirit worked, but it's an empty shell. And it's up to the Spirit if the Spirit wants to use it again. But if not, it can be dispensed with or just seen as nothing more than that's the way the Spirit worked in the past. But there's nothing on that binding for us now in terms of directing us or wisdom we can attain. And I just think that there's a lot of problems happening in this. I'll give you a couple more to kind of
before you jump to the others. It strikes me that the doctrine of the Incarnation is relevant at this point when we think about history and the embodiment of the faith in terms of the church. We belong to a people. If we think about the Christian faith as just a set of abstractions or just some kind of vague set of ideas that get passed along that we believe in, we lose touch with the fact that it's through the means of the church, the preaching and the sacraments, of course, but the actual handing down of the faith from one generation to another. And we should be grateful to God, of course, but also to people and to institutions for what those institutions of people did to contribute and hand the faith down to us. Now, my guess is that he would agree with everything I just said, but there's nothing in his article that would give you a sense that he thinks in those terms. And I think the embodiment of the faith in the church, even though it's imperfect, we need to be loyal to institutions and to people. And I think nations as well.
The invisible church seems to be what drives him. And my hunch is, being at Regent Park, because he probably has a Baptist background, which may explain the kind of emphasis on the invisible to the detriment of visibility. And he will talk often of continuity and change, but he really doesn't give any strong examples of what the continuity looks like. And he really goes to town against anyone who would try to retrieve some riches out of that and hold to a continuity that way. And he seems to really privilege this notion of the fallen real world. And here, in a sense, we get another abstraction, is all about loss, vulnerability, and lack of control, right? And so to be an actual Christian is somehow to accept this truth about things, that things are all in flux and transition, and that it's all about losing, to deny Christ means to lose everything, including civilizational stature, It's to become vulnerability, meaning the rest of the world's not going to like you, and lack of control, meaning you're not going to be in charge of the cultural meta-narrative. And I think, again, he's confusing what people who are trying to retrieve the richness of their heritage and to allow that to help them navigate the present are all about. It isn't a return to libido dominandi, but from a Christian perspective. I know there are some people out there that talk in that language, but what it has to do with is exactly the exact opposite. I mean, when we have things as fundamental as children being pressured to have surgery on a psychology that doesn't know how to receive the gift of its own sexual embodiment, right? Then we have problems that we should be speaking as truly loving our neighbor the truth into from riches where we don't have to see the human being. This is a legitimate interpretation of what is the human being or good for it. And that isn't me somehow we're just supposed to raise our hands up and say, oh, well, this is where the Spirit is these days, and we shouldn't draw upon the rich wisdom we get out of Genesis and the church's reflection on it in order to actually shape and direct our cultural moment. So it's not about controlling and forcing everyone to believe what we believe, but it is about contributing and being salt and light in a way that draws on the riches of our frame of reference and not just following the spirit of the age.
I think one of the things that comes to mind is the many committee meetings that I was in when I was involved in urban ministry, and I would hear people use these arguments actually to exercise domination over other people. So in other words, it became a kind of fog that would blind you to the fact that there was, somebody would say something absurd, and none of us are supposed to judge it as such. We're all supposed to, let everybody speak, right? And then, so you're listening to a bunch of nonsense being thrown into the conversation, and then at the very end, in a very, I guess, sly way, the people who organized the meeting managed to sort of get their will or their way behind this fog of participation. If you get my drift.
Yeah.
I think that that's sort of a pattern that you see. It's not only it's not only directly in the kinds of circles that you see, but people who insist on these notions of freedom and all of that always want to enforce it rigidly and do not tolerate dissent. So,
yeah. Well, and that, again, it's with language like this that you really get perplexed as to where they want to go with it. For example, he says all forms of life are entangled with idolatry. I agree. And structural sin. Okay, I agree, even though I know where that, when I hear the word structural, that automatically sets a little itch off in my ear. And then the next thing is the spiritual, moral, and political struggle is to find ways to identify with Christ and participate in the Spirit's work, and thereby to disidentify with the past, and present idols. But why is everything? I mean, he's the one who set up the straw man of an idol, of people just trying to turn to the past to turn an idol of it. But there are plenty of people that are trying to draw upon the riches of their heritage, spiritual roots and moral roots, to navigate the here and now with a set of things, a deposit that the church has been given, something that is in continuity with its faith rather than another idol of the spirit of the age. And so, again, his either-or framework has locked out any alternatives, which I think most people trying to retrieve wouldn't fit into his grid. And then he does, when he turns to Maritain, and he talks about his first conversion to where he becomes the equivalent of, and here's some language that is telling, the equivalent of, let's see if I can find it here. Oh, yeah. He turned to a political movement dedicated to defending family, faith, and flag against the threat of the quote-unquote woke ideologies of the day, namely communism, anarchism, and liberalism. So what we get here now is another kind of picture being painted that if you're concerned about families, your faith heritage and its cultural riches, and even your country, its flag and what it represents as a gift to you and to the world in its own way, imperfect but a gift, then all of a sudden, if you're concerned about that more than the influx of these changing ideas like communism, anarchism, you are a fascist.
Well, and it's make France great again. Is how
Yes.
described.
Yeah, he plays that game. Yeah, he plays that game.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah, the argument that he's putting forward here, I mean, he at this point he's genuinely showing his political and ideological stripes.
Yeah.
But the entire thrust of this, I find, well, I'm a historian, so the entire argument that paying attention to history, looking at history, and so on, I would really want to refer him to C.S. Lewis's introduction to Athanasius on the Incarnation, where he says that you really need to read old books because every generation has its blind spots. And sort of by definition, we can't see our own blind spots. But if you read an old book, they've got different blind spots than we've got, and we can identify their blind spots, but they don't have the same blind spots we do, so they can identify ours. And the problem that with this entire program is he's not letting history identify our blind spots.
Yeah, exactly. It's similar when he attacks people who want to go for quote unquote the medieval period, right? He thinks that they all are trying to basically take that with its prejudices, which I guarantee for him mean women being locked into certain roles in life and gays not being able to run down the street in their celebrations. I guarantee that's what's going on here. It doesn't take far to start to see where this goes. But what I think he misses is people who, like Lewis, are looking at discarded images are not about repristination. They're exactly on your point. So when we look to, for example, a fuller transcendental vision that Christianity offered that doesn't have a competitive view of God grounded in sheer power, but actually a much richer Trinitarian theology and metaphysic that allows for creatures and their meanings and natures and purposes to be received as gifts and enacted truthfully, that is showing us a lens to see our own metaphysical weaknesses and blind spots. It's not saying we're going to be able to take that picture and force it on to reality, right? No, that's not what we're saying at all. It's saying there may be purchases on reality that they have, even if some other aspects of that have to be discarded and should be.
Right.
I would say though, Tom, that there are certain things that we can say are true regardless of what period of time you live in.
Yeah.
And for example, anatomy hasn't changed over the course of human history. There are certain features that define you as male and certain things that define you as female, and that those things have to have some kind of cultural you need to have some institutions. You need to have some customs that help you to direct those tenets or the purposes of those features to your sexuality or whatever, in the interest of the society at large, and to families in particular, and obviously to the welfare of individuals. So. Let's just go to the subject of homosexuality. Obviously, this is something that you can't reconcile with anatomy. And there are some implications to, bad outcomes. There are certain outcomes that are just not healthy, physically not healthy for the people who are engaged in homosexual activity. That's not just a medieval way of thinking. That's not just a 19th century way of thinking. That's just simply dealing with some facts on the ground. Now, some people would like to say facts don't convey any kind of value or meaning. But that begs the question. The question that's begged is, are we created or not? When people make that fact value divide, they're in a sense buying into a sort of meaningless reality, physical reality that doesn't have a creator, or at least doesn't have a creator that has purposes or ends in mind. And that's just simply that's just simply cheating. So anyway, I'll wrap it up with that.
Yeah, but I think that he's saying basically any attempt to preserve a kind of ideal moral order, and that's how they see it. It's always just an interpretation or a cultural artifact, but it isn't grounded in, because no one has any access to reality. And furthermore, reality is always being transfigured and renewed anyway. So with Richard Hayes, if God was against it, back when Richard Hayes taught at Duke, but isn't against it now because his son's teaching at Fuller, then God has changed his mind. The Spirit has all of a sudden caught up with the Hayes family.
But that's exactly what I was getting at earlier with what we see with these people who stress the freshness of the Spirit in the moment and want to isolate our moment in time and separate it from the past.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't really mean to derail the discussion on Maritain, but I did think that observation from Luise was important here.
Yeah, and I think, again, the past, no matter how you look at it, in our own cultural past as being people of a culture and civilization, part of which, no matter how much renewal we have as being Christians, is part of our fundamentally and gifted identity. The part that isn't part of our continued identity is the sin aspects of it. But to make all of one's civilizational heritage to be all idol and to be all sin and to have no created goods or gifts in it is itself pretty telling of what his view of creation is. And it's all just new creation. And any attempt to, it's very Heraclitean, and he kind of admits as much, all is flux, right? And it's basically flux until the Trinitarian demiurge comes in and imposes a new set of fresh meanings on it for that particular here and now, and then it becomes very, time becomes very punctuated and then disconnected, because any given here and now and the Spirit's work in it, somehow he talks of continuity and discontinuity, but he never makes any connection there. And this is what I think, the people that he's castigating as just mere fascist, racists, and everything else are all lumped in just because they find value in the gift of a particular civilizational heritage that even as Christians, they see as having some riches for them, even if
Yeah, so I think one of the things I'd like to sort of introduce at this point, as we kind of are coming to the end, is how do you respond to this stuff? I mean, so for me, obviously, kind of, put my cards to the table a little bit here over the course of the show. And, there are people who would call me a fascist or call me a racist because based on that kind of, or a homophobe or whatever, based on these things. I think that, what I more or less my disposition toward this with regard to when those things are said is just kind of a benign neglect, and I don't think you can actually argue about this kind of stuff because what you have is an ad hominem moment where you're being attacked, and it's almost as though you shouldn't even dignify the attack. I also think that you can't, if you live a life that doesn't demonstrate any of the things that you're accused of, then you refute the argument in the best way you can. But we live in a world where you're kind of unknown. You're just sort of like a name and a set of publications living in this ether. And then, people can label you in certain ways and not know you at all, not have any basis. So, this is kind of another feature to the moment we find ourselves in with, modernity, but also just kind of the technological moment that we're in, where you can have people maybe who say all the right things but live terrible lives. And we've known many people like that, where things are revealed about people who are politically correct or praised by the left, but are awful people in person. And then there are people that, get bad reputation. I think about like Doug Wilson. So I know Doug personally. The way Doug conducts himself in terms of his own family life and conduct with people is really, really praiseworthy. But he's attacked constantly by people who don't know him and don't have any personal experience with any of that. And a lot of the stuff sticks. Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, I don't know that with the kind of demonization, I just don't. I mean, like I said, maybe I'll grant this author, Bretherton a point, is that yes, we do live in a world in which Christians who try to take a stand for things often get hurled and insulted at, and they know that even they're not going to have any control over that, and they live with integrity in light of it. That's part of what being a loving Christian is that when somebody throws a stone at your face, not returning the favor, but actually turning to your riches and the power of truth and communicating it for the good of the one you're communicating it to. I think they always think through the Foucaultian lens that anytime Christians stand up strongly for what they believe, they're just interested in asserting control and power over everything. They can't imagine that actually that people can speak the truth in love, and that may have a seriousness with it that was maybe akin to Jesus saying things that he took very seriously as truth, in which he was killed for and died. So we recognize the vulnerability there. I think the thing is that, and before I say what I was going to say as a follow-up, I mean, I think there are a lot of things we can agree with Bretherton on, the way in which people can become attracted to Christianity merely for how it functions as an integrative way of looking at things rather than for the God that is at the center of it and the liberation that comes within it. So we don't want to turn a culture or a set of or even a worldview into an idol. But that doesn't mean you get rid of those things either. Those are part of the whole package. And so if somebody gets allured in because of the richness of its offerings, and that's the first taste of it, that doesn't mean we have to sit here and say, oh, they're just idolaters until they have my conversion to democracy. That itself has its own kind of sinister idolatry with it too, saying that the preferred form of democracy is an exhibition of true conversion. I think that's a little bit presumptuous. And so I guess the last point for me is just one on past. And I don't know that the author would disagree with this, but I think it's worth talking about. Instead of it being nostalgia, is simply, as you say, Glenn, we can't live without it because it is always present. It's goods and it's bads, it's good steps and it's bad steps. And going to look for places where steps seemed good in light of our faith, for wisdom, insight, so that we don't make bad steps in the future is not a bad thing to do. Or like Chris, because we have been dealing with Christians' interpretation of what is real and permanent in some cases and reaffirmed in the resurrection in new ways, the created order for that matter, then we should be looking for ways to express and value that created gift and order from the wisdom of Christians and civilization that has been impacted by Christianity. So I just don't see why that should be a problem. And so the past is never irrelevant to the present, but that doesn't mean the past is sort of a repository of answers that answer every here and now question. It just means it's a wisdom base, and there is some riches there that help us grab hold of those permanent things and orient ourselves to God and each other the right way.
That's a good way to wrap it up there, Tom. Anything you want to say, Glenn, as we conclude?
Yes, someone once commented that Christianity is, by its very essence, a conservative religion, in the sense that it is always based on something in the past. It's always based on Scripture. And along with Scripture, it is based on the fact that we have people who have studied Scripture, who have thought about Scripture, who have developed interpretations of Scripture and understandings of what Scripture means, the Trinity, Christology, all of these kinds of things over the centuries, and that we live out our faith based on the past, ultimately. And the idea that we need to live out our faith in the present, cut off from that, or somehow separate ourselves from that, it strikes me as being sort of patently absurd.
Well, spoken like an historian.
Yep.
Anyway, well, this has been a good conversation. Thanks for bringing up this essay, Tom. We'll, of course, include a link to it in the show notes. This is from Comment. This is a Cardus publication, which is unsurprising, knowing a little bit about those guys. Anyway, we're glad that you got this far along in the show, and we want to encourage you to look into something. Our documentary is out now with Canon Plus, and it's entitled A Pugcast Pilgrimage, Luise, Oxford, and Our Postmodern Age, and we're very pleased with how it turned out. You can view it now on Canon Plus, and we encourage you to check it out there. It is something that I think, obviously, it's got all the things that Oxford has going for it, and of course that includes Luise and the time we spent at the kilns and all that. But anyways, if you're an ongoing listener to the podcast, a number of these things are familiar to you because we did a series of shows when we were over there, recorded some interviews and so forth. But anyway, there's more to it than that. There's a lot in the documentary that didn't make it into our shows, and we encourage you to check it out. Anyway, you can also check out our Patreon page if you like what we do, and we are always pleased to welcome new supporters. Anyway, that's enough for now. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. To learn more about the church, you can visit trinityreformedkirk.com. trinityreformedkirk.com.